Well, hey, friends, welcome. Roy and I back at it for one final special episode about our Church and Trauma Summit with one of our guest panelists. And we're here with Jed Mullinex today. Jed's the president of Within Reach. He spent about 15 years leading local churches in New England and Omaha, and then was drawn to the possibility of the church uniting for the city's good. And that's what we're going to hear about today from Jed. So, Roy and Jed, how you guys doing today?
So good.
If only the listeners knew what it took for Jed to get on this podcast.
That's right. Oh, man, it's so good to be with you, though. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk. I know Roy is. For those who don't know, I'm going to have you, Jed, just talk about what Within Reach is. But we did a podcast, I think, back in the spring, Roy, after we went to a Within Reach gathering. We talked about the Barna's State of the City report. And so you can go back and listen to that because we do highlight some of the statistics that really relate to our work here at Christian Heritage. But I'm excited to hear about that today from Jed. So Jed, I gave you a little bit of a bio to listeners, but tell us a little bit more about yourself. I'm really curious about the New England part. I was a pastor in upstate New York for a while. We were 15 miles from New England. We were 15 miles from the Vermont border. We were in the capital region, just north of Albany. So that's kind of, we're from Nebraska, but a little bit of a second home for us because of all the relationships we made. So just tell us about yourself and kind of what brought you to Nebraska.
I know upstate New York well, but my only experience with Albany is staying there at a hotel just north of the city on the weekend that a NASCAR event was happening and paying 3 times the price for a hotel that I should have that night. It was incredible. And if you're a part of the NASCAR scene, bless you. But that was a special night. But we love upstate New York. And New England, of course, is really kind of home for us. It's where our family really came to. It's where we have 5 kids. Our kids were born, most of them, and then grew up, all of them. And it really gave us a love for the local church, for culture, diversity, seafood, beach, and mountain, and everything in between. And we just love that. So what brought us back to the Omaha Metro was 2 things. Number one, our family lives back here on my wife's side, and we had a tribe of 5, and we knew we needed a village, with our tribe to kind of help us raise our kids and just provide that support. And then coinciding with that was this hunch that I had that had been growing for 5 or 7 years, that local church leadership was not what I would do for the next half of my life. I knew I'd been in local church leadership for about, at the time, 15 to 17 years, and decided that we were probably anticipating a change. We moved back to the Omaha Metro and led our church for 4 more years before I stepped into the Within Reach team on a volunteer level, on a board level, and then ultimately in 2020 started leading the charge there. So yeah, that's a bit of our journey and what we experienced there in the Northeast.
So what specific part of New England? Because Roy's also, Roy was at a camp in New Hampshire, which I think maybe you knew that. But what part of New England were you in?
Yeah, so I don't know where you were in New Hampshire. We were in Lowell, Massachusetts. Our church was in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, right? So just on the outer loop of, there's 2 belts that surround Boston on the outer belt, 495. So it's a great area.
Great area. People from Nebraska, like if you've never been to the Northeast, you don't realize how close everything is.
Yeah.
And, when people say, oh, I'm, heading out to Alliance or Shadron, like you're going for the whole weekend. You can't just get there and back. So, in New England, it's like, a couple hours here and there, I can get wherever I want. So unique world.
Yeah. Great call.
So tell us about Within Reach. You talked about what prompted you to start it, but what do you, what is it that you guys do? What's your specialty? What's your niche in the kingdom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you who we are and how we got to where we are today, kind of all, and hopefully under a couple of minutes. Within Reach, if you get around us, is just this beautiful, growing community of leaders and community business in the church who share a commitment to 2 things. We say we have 2 big buckets or 2 big targets that we commit all of our energy, time, and resources to, and that's the city reaching and renewal. We tether both of those to 2 big imperatives Jesus gave us. One, the Great Commission to see everybody reunited to the heart of our Heavenly Father through the good news of what Jesus has done for us, and renewal around what we refer to as the Great Petition, which is the Lord's Prayer. It's sort of our terminology because it goes great with Great Commission. And so the petition being, when he prayed and taught us to pray, our Father in heaven, holy is your name, may your kingdom come. and your will be done on earth. And so we contextualize that and say to each of us, wherever you live, God's given us this little plot of earth to pray for and then work toward the realization of the kingdom of God, which Jesus inaugurated through his life, death, resurrection. And so we believe that by his spirit is doing that, wants to do that through his people all across the city, regardless of what sector of work they happen to be in, or service or volunteerism or leadership or neighboring. And so this community is that now. Now, let me tell you kind of how we got here, and then I'll flesh that out just a bit more. In 2016, Mark Ashton at Christ Community, Ron Dotzler at Abide, Les Beecham at Lifegate, Mark Zinder at King of Kings, and many others got together and said, hey, we've been doing a lot of work for the last 3 decades around unity and prayer and mission and things like that. But what if we all came together around, at the time, was this idea of city reaching. And since then, we've added this renewal piece. And so the church really came together. We saw 25, 27 churches in the metro say, hey, we want to be part of this. And really on a volunteer level, this leadership team stewarded that early movement between 2016 and 2020. In 2020, I had been around the board for about 3 years. And of course, then 2020, remember all of that. But in January, came onto the scene in leadership. They were gracious enough to welcome me to help lead within Reach on a president level. And so I did, and then COVID happened, and we can talk about this in a bit, not to kind of steal the narrative from there, but that's when the network really started to gain some steam. Interestingly, we entered into a period of listening, and that's when we began to shape our mission with the renewal side. And that's where then people just became more and more attracted to the movement. And so we now today are a community of over 60 partners on the local church level. Probably up to 100 local churches have some kind of affiliation within Reach. And one of the things we can talk about that we're so excited about and proud about is also our growing partnership with the Archdiocese here in Omaha, and many of our Catholic brothers and sisters who are a part of what's happening, and we're a part of what's happening in their parishes and communities. Since then, also, we've seen this really strong growth of community, or we call them ministry and marketplace leaders, or community and marketplace leaders. And that's been really special too. So people in entrepreneurism, in the sector of education, in small business, in big business, in finance, in city leadership, who say we want to work together around what we'll talk about in a moment, our core initiatives that we've committed to for the next 10 years. And there's just this enthusiasm to be in the room together. There's a love to be around like-minded leaders. There's a joy in saying we're about the same thing in the city, even though we're called to unique things. And so that's our movement within Reach, and we love it. It's a lot of fun.
I love that. It sounds like God was stirring before. You mentioned the pastors who had said, hey, we've been getting together. History as a pastor was with a campus ministry for a while, and I found that uniting churches was always difficult, but it sounded like God had just been paving the way for it to happen. Is that kind of...
Yeah. I don't want to make it sound easier than it probably was, for sure. Because I got to come into this movement 3 decades in, when it had gone through various iterations. Within Reach launched in 2016, but there were other names of city movements that were much smaller and less on the map, and maybe less known and more gritty and more pain, and having to do the work of Jesus to labor for unity that we see Jesus praying for in John 14, John 17. And today we internally use this value that we follow the favor. We feel like God's given us favor in terms of the movement, and our job now is to steward and honor it. I give all honor to the leaders, men and women, who went before us for 30 plus years, who did the hard work and the work that's oftentimes not recognized, of just being faithful to Jesus's call for his people. And so, yes, by the time we arrived and I was in my seat around the table before I was even leading, we recognized that the work they had done was paying dividends, or we were seeing fruit of it. And we just said, we got to build this from what God's already doing.
Jed, hearing that, when I think about, for us as an organization that's been around for over 40 years, and primarily it's been foster care and caring for vulnerable children and families, I would say for us, the last 3.5 to 4 years is very similar. There's definitely a shifting happening I think there's some fundamental changes happening within our culture, within the church. And part of that is our evolution. But yet we would not be here if it wasn't for the previous 40 years of those who were being faithful to what the doors that God was opening up for them. But the climate has radically changed. I think part of that is COVID. I think it's, this post-COVID world that we all live in. So I can resonate a lot with that in terms of our own executive leadership and how do we steward well, almost like God's doing something. How do we jump on board with what he's doing and moving and seeing his favor in ways that we have never seen before? And that's fascinating. You're almost compelled to follow, even though it's in areas that are maybe uncomfortable or we've never been in before, but God's like, no, this is where I want you. And so, I just love the way you articulated the stewardship part of that, of those who have gone before you, but the opportunities that lay ahead, so I love that.
Yeah. So good, Roy. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Encouraged for you.
So let's talk about the State of the City project. I know we're shorter on time for at least maybe part one, maybe we'll do a part two. But let's talk about that project. And I know Roy has some thoughts he'll want to share, but just
I love this, by the way.
Yeah, Roy,
for those who can't see it, I'm doing the State of the City report.
Dog ears.
You can see all my Post-it notes, Jed.
Oh, we're so encouraged. My heart is full. My heart is full. Thank you.
Jed, once you got that book in your hand, what were your major impressions? Did anything surprise you? I mean, you were a part of the whole process, but once you were able to take it in, were you like, hey, I didn't expect this. Was there anything like that?
Yeah, there certainly was. I'll give you a statement that the whole project was built on, and its inception was right in and around COVID in 2020 that the vision was birthed out of. And the statement we use over and over is that to love our city, we must know our city, and knowing begins with listening. Okay, so period. So we entered this project with a posture of listening. And what we found is when you listen to your context, your neighborhood, community, city, region, whatever it may be, when you listen to your context, you'll hear things, you'll be awakened to things that you would have never seen otherwise. And we can talk about this if you want, but we listen in a variety of ways. Certainly, there were many things that we noticed. Number one, we interviewed over 500 neighbors around the metro, and we heard things that we refer to as their value structure or the priority structure of our neighbors in the metro. And we heard things that some might say, oh, well, of course you should have known that. But yeah, but you don't know unless you know. And so we heard them saying things like, we value community. We value cleanliness, which could look in a number of different ways, like cleaning up my dilapidated neighbor's house, or mowing the street across the lawn, or filling the potholes, or improving green spaces. And we value community. There's this deep hunger in the hearts of humanity that's represented here in Omaha for connection, in that you already hinted at this, coming during a time when we're the connections we have are being frayed by some of the realities that are taking place in our world and culture today. And so we heard that, and what that allowed us to do was say, what sort of applications could we give to begin to address the yearnings of the hearts of our neighbors? So that's one thing. Another thing we learned that's unique about Omaha is, while on one hand we have very similar in terms of patterns of those who would self-identify as followers of Jesus, on the other hand, we have lower than national averages when it comes to practicing Christians. A practicing Christian, very simply, is someone who says, I'm a follower of Jesus, I have a local church, and I've been to that local church in the last month, and my faith is very important to me. So high level of self-identified Christians, lower than national average on the area of practicing Christians.
Sure.
But then what we saw as we started to get into that was, one of the things that's unique about the Omaha Metro is that there's a large percentage of people who attend church once or twice a year, and a much smaller percentage of people who never attend church than national averages. So what that tells us is there's still sort of a cultural vein of affiliation to the local church than there may be nationwide. However, where that takes root in the heart, their relationship with Jesus, which leads to a relationship with the local church, and how they live that out on the day-to-day level, it's not permeating our city. So we see that there's some work to be done. We could go into that further. A couple of other things we saw, which maybe not a surprise, is levels of disconnectedness, angst, anxiety, depression, separation from neighbor, sense of trauma or self kind of experience of harm in a person's life are high, and in fact are through the roof when it comes to some of what we see as national norms, especially by those who would self-identify as Christians. So we look at that and we just see there's hurting people who are looking for help. But here's the last thing I'll share. But they're not turning to the church for help.
Yep.
So we internally at Within Reach refer to this as the gap. There's a world kind of outside our door that's experiencing much of what I just shared, which, listen, every other state, city, community around the world are experiencing this on some level or another. Then we have a large percentage of people who self-identify as Christian, but the majority of people who are hurting or lonely or looking to be connected aren't turning toward the local church that somehow they identify with to receive help and support. And what that shows us is not it's the right time for the local church to get more people through their doors, but it's actually the time for the people of Jesus to go out their doors in their neighborhoods and communities to be neighbors as Jesus has called us to be. So those are a handful of things. I mean, other things are this. I'll mention this just for sake of millennials and Gen Zs. We have an action-oriented young population. Like James and Roy, I don't know how old you guys are. I'm guessing you're 40s or below. James, like you would strike me as like late 20s, early 30s. Maybe I'm off just a skosh.
40. I look good I'll be 40 in next month.
Yeah, you just became my favorite guest ever.
For November.
Come on.
Yes.
So,
mine too. Yeah. I hope I always look 29.
Yeah, that's the reason I sit in the shadows. I realize I'm here with you in a Starbucks, and so no one really knows. Is he 22 or 48? I don't know. But you know, one of the things we realized is millennials and Gen Z, they want to be in the game of making a difference in their community.
Yep.
We have to give them a vision that's worth giving their life to.
That's good.
So we say this in the project that generation, so let's just say 38 to 40-year-olds and younger, have to see, or they want to see, that Jesus is good before they'll believe that he's true. And so the opportunity for the church to be about demonstrating the goodness of Jesus, which then could lead toward them exploring whether Jesus is actually real and they want to give their lives to him. So those are a variety of things that we learned. I understand I kind of painted a broad map and would be glad to go a little further in where you want to.
No, that's really good. And I know that the connection part connects with us. I know, Roy, you had some thoughts on the connection piece, I think, from the study, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think just to carry, that conversation on, Jed, when we look at the population we serve, which are, those who are impacted by trauma in the foster care system, those who are completely isolated, one of the things that we are trying to tackle is the church has to be flourishing to be able to meet their needs. The ways that we have done that, I would say, is explain some of the gaps that you're seeing. We see the behaviors. This is not ridiculing the church, but the way that we've been modeling and showing them the truth versus being good is so true to the experiences, as we are a bridge builder to the very vulnerable populations that you're talking about. So man, that is so good. And I think is one reason why we want to host the Church and Trauma Summit here in Lincoln, to talk about that gap. And talk about what are the implications then for the church and its leadership, to say, how do we come across as good and healthy and flourishing? Obviously, it's God's word, it's Christ in us that makes that possible, but there is a massive gap in terms of them understanding that and knowing that. And so I just loved what you said. And I think that's why I'm really excited that you're going to be joining us for the summit, so we can unpack these things with church leaders and lay leaders within the church to talk about, so what are we going to do about that? Can we have conversations about that? And again, I think what you're doing in Omaha, we're behind the 8 ball, so to speak, in regards to what we need to be doing here in Lincoln. And to be honest with you, what Within Reach is doing has been part of what James and I have talked about. We need to start having these conversations in Lincoln. They're not specifically just for Omaha. So I think being a part and attending these events and seeing the work that you're doing is we need to start breaking ground in very specific ways around that. So just really appreciate your work in this, and it's inspiring but convicting, right? It's
Yep.
we've got to get to a place where the work that we're doing is redemptive. And I love your word of renewal, but it's got to be redemptive.
Yeah.
And so I just love that.
So true, man. Thank you, Roy. I agree with you.
So Jed, when you think about, I mean, you're coming to this Church and Trauma Summit, you didn't know a whole lot about Christian heritage other than, hey, you connected with Roy. You said, yes, I'd love to be a part. When you hear the words church and trauma, and you mentioned that word earlier as a part of the research and the findings.
Yep.
When you think of church and trauma together, like what kind of comes to mind? What do you feel when you see those words together?
Well, I can tell you this. I mean, my mind goes in two different directions. One, and I'll just name it because I think some of our audience might feel it, is that there's a reality of some people within the church have experienced trauma in that context, that they say, oh, church and trauma, that's my story, or I know someone for whom that's their story. Because this isn't the narrative necessarily that we're talking about primarily. I just want to acknowledge that that's real.
It's good.
And that's not in heart with Jesus's vision for his church, and that he wants to renew that and change that.
That's good.
When it comes to people experiencing trauma and how the church comes to their aid or their assistance, I'd say my heart goes to the Gospels, where Jesus met people in trauma. Now, their trauma could have been physical trauma, it could have been social trauma, it could have been emotional, it could have been cultural, whatever it might be. There's a sense that life is good and somehow my life is not. And there's a gap between, especially in that context. I think that we could talk about 21st century West, but there's that idea that God created something for good and I'm on the outs and I'm not experiencing that. Now, when we put that through the lens of the scriptures, we would say God creates for good, sin breaks down. Sometimes it's our own sin. Oftentimes it's living within a broken world, and we experience the outworking of that. But Jesus came to redeem and renew and set free, and he calls now his people to be a part of that restoration project and process. And that's where I think our narrative is going to lie in this time together. So what encourages me is, I think when the church is on point, they're on point along the heart of Jesus, and two things are happening. Number one, they've created a setting or a process within the local church where people who are coming can find and experience healing, the journey of healing. I want to be careful about saying that healing is a point. It's not a point, it's a process. And oftentimes we start the process at a point in our lives when we've come to the end of ourselves, or when we come to the end of the help available to us. Okay, so that's one. The other thing I think that we see with Jesus is most of the time he wasn't healing trauma in the context of a synagogue. Okay, so generally it was on the streets. It was as he was going from one place to the next. It's around a dinner table. It's in the context of, fill in the blank if you read the Gospels. I think the same has to be true in the 21st century, especially in a context where more and more the culture is moving away from an affiliation with the local church and looking for help or hope in that context. So how much more should it be, or will it be true, that the first steps of hope and help start actually outside of the local church? What that means for me is we've got to see the church as a commissioned people rather than a place in time on a weekend. Because most of our culture, what we found in Omaha, is 9 out of 10 are not going to turn to the local church for help or hope, especially if they're outside of a faith relationship with Jesus. So what that means for me, and what we're committed to within Reach, is this, what we call an activation of the people of Jesus in the places they live, work, and play, equipped to know, how do I build relationships simply for the valuing dignity of the person or the neighbor on the other side of the table, cubicle, road, street from me. And then in the context of that relationship, how do I begin to love them with the heart of Jesus such that a friendship could grow where they would recognize that this is a safe space, place where I could actually begin to share my life with them. And maybe that becomes the first step of Hope Help. And then that can eventually be tethered back to the local church that provides some of those resources that you and I as neighbors might not have. So I just think it's a two-part thing. I think it's a both and, not either or, but that's where I would say church and trauma. That's where my mind goes.
That's good.
That's awesome.
I love what you said. The church is a group of commissioned people, not a place at a certain, or not a group of people at a certain place at a certain time on a weekend. So I mean, and I think that represents our heart. I mean, a lot of what we do at Christian Heritage, we equip people to say, you are going out to meet those who are vulnerable. Yeah. You are the church when you're doing that. That's what we do. It's not about, meetings and gatherings. And yes, as a millennial, I will say that's what we long for. But it's not what we had growing up. And I think there are some winds of change that are happening, which are good. I know that we're about up against time. Roy, you got anything else you want to add or ask quick?
No, other than come to the summit, get to hear from Jed and others that are in this space. And I think that's our heart. I think you summed it up really well. Our hope for the summit is to begin to commission, how do we meet not just those sitting in our pews, but those who are not there right now? And how do we go about that in a unified, collaborative way where we have shared goals, we have a shared heart for our city, and be that, for me, that light shining brightly on a hill. We are called to that. And so I just love it. So I just encourage people to come to the summit September 17th and hear more about these kinds of level of conversations that we want to have.
Yep. All right. Less than 2 weeks away. Jed, this has been so good. We're going to have to do a part 2.
Yes.
Maybe we'll do it after the summit, and when people can have a chance to meet you. Sure. But yes, you can sign up at the summit at chne.org/summit and register. It's from 10 to 2 on September 17th. Jed, this has been so good, man.
What an honor, guys. Really excited to be with you here in a couple of weeks. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, everybody, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.